Hey everybody, Happy New Year from Your Mountain. This is Nephi Cole, executive producer from the Your Mountain podcast. Thanks for listening to the podcast. We hope you're enjoying this show. We care deeply here about the future of our lands, water, and wildlife, and all the outdoor recreation opportunities they provide. We hope you'll check out our previous episodes, because whether you're interested in burning sage-grouse poop in Steve Rennell's garage, or visiting with a sitting senator about the federal budget, maybe it's the future of funding wildlife conservation, but we've got an episode for you. We don't do this for a paycheck. We do it because we're passionate about providing the whole story. The holidays are over, but we hope you'll binge on Your Mountain. It will fit nicely with your New Year's resolutions. You'll gain understanding, not pounds. So subscribe at Your Mountain on iTunes, or find us on Stitcher, TuneIn, Google Play, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, Podbean, or any place else you get a podcast. Please rate our podcast, comment, and share. You can follow us at It's Your Mountain on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. This week, we're talking about the number one impediment to securing participation and the future of recreation in the great outdoors. That's access. We're concentrating on lands in this episode, but remember, whether it's through lands, tools, opportunity, or mentorship, be part of helping others find their mountain. From all of us at Your Mountain, have a great year. Here's the podcast.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain. Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. As always, or almost always, I'm your host, David Williams. And as almost always, sitting across the desk from me is one Nephi Cole.
Good morning, Dave.
Good morning, Nephi, or afternoon, or evening, or whatever it is.
No one knows.
Nobody knows. It's whatever time it is when you're listening to this, right? So we don't have Mike McGrady today, which is becoming kind of a usual occurrence. We might have to have a board meeting and discuss future hosting options.
Well, he probably thinks it's important to do his real job.
Well,
and he's right.
That is important. Because we do have real jobs. If this paid a single bill, I'd be more inclined no, we're doing it anyway. It doesn't pay a single bill.
That's right.
It doesn't pay.
So don't be careful what you say, because I know you're lying.
I know.
I don't know what I do.
We'll do it anyway.
Yeah.
So, Nephi.
Yes.
You just got yourself back, and I think that horn in the background was a nice transition. So you just got yourself back came back from an elk hunt.
That's right. It was a great opportunity to hang out with a bunch of really cool dudes and see no elk.
Yeah,
so
you were telling me you didn't even...
I got skunked this year. Actually, that's not true. That's absolutely not true.
No, I know it's not true, because you told the story earlier about helping somebody get their first bull
That's
elk.
right.
And that was a cool story.
Yes.
But you, on a personal level, you're making, like, when are you inviting everybody over for your tag soup?
No, it's this afternoon. I cooked it already. It's upstairs.
Did you?
Yeah,
I thought I smelled something on the way in.
Yeah, it smelled like a lot of tags. So
once we finish that, you can come over to my place and we'll have, like elk stew and deer stroganoff and antelope backstrap, because I punched all those tags. What I'm really curious about is how our guest today did this hunting season. So we are joined today by Joel Webster of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Joel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get into your background, I know you're a hunter. Can you top Nephi's level of success this year?
I had a great season.
Yeah, there you go. That's all you needed to say. Thanks a lot, Dave.
Yeah, I live in Montana, and my archery season was a little bit thin. I didn't get out a ton, but I did get out on opener a rifle elk and killed a bull on opening morning. It was one of the more grueling packouts I've had. It was like 13 degrees and blowing like sustained 30 miles an hour and 6 inches of snow as we drug this thing up over a mountain. I killed it basically on the base of a scree slope. And then towards the end of the season, I killed my best mule deer. Had a great trip where we all tagged out, and it was awesome. So I had a good year.
So I kind of knew that because I'd seen some of his Facebook posts earlier. So this is just a big setup to make you feel bad, Nephi.
Well, I don't. Do you feel like you failed? I feel good.
No, you should feel good. You should feel good. You got a bunch of guys out.
Yeah, I did a lot of good propaganda.
And you got somebody their first elk. And so I count that as you got yourself an elk this year. Because anytime you can get somebody that's never killed an elk on an elk and get them that first bull and get them, interested in getting back out there the next year, I'm going to give you good credit for that.
We took two this last trip. It's unfortunate we didn't find any. We had cow tags for a bunch of guys, and we took two people who'd never been elk hunting before, and one of them actually not elk hunting, who'd never taken an elk before. So one of them was a former special operations guy, a unit guy, and I took him on a bow hunt previously and we called a bull in last year within 45 yards of him. And this is a guy who's the highest level of the U.S. military, and he just lost it when that bull elk got within 45 yards of him. He had a watch on that had his pulse. He recorded it. He's standing there with a bow. His pulse was 150, just standing there staring at this bull. And this is a guy who, 20 years before retiring at the highest levels of the U.S. military. And then there was the other guy we brought this year out on this cow hunt was a guy he's an editor, author, and I just thought it'd be fun to get him out, and he's going to do a story about the trip, but ultimately tag soup for him too. So that was a little bit disappointing. The area we went to, typically there's tons of cows there, and Game and Fish has been trying to really reduce the numbers in this herd, and I'd like to say congratulations, Brian Nesvik. You've done a great job.
Well, if I remember correctly, the herd objective for that unit is actually 0.
It's 0. Yeah.
So they're getting closer.
We saw 3 bulls, so I don't think he got to 0, but wow, he did a fantastic job of scaring them off of where they used to be. So,
well,
dang you, Brian Nesvik, and your Game and Fish expertise.
Well, congratulations to you though, Nephi, on getting other people out there in the field, and congratulations to you, Joel, on a successful season. It's funny because I had similar pack out experiences to you with the bitter cold this year and snow, and I've heard that. I just feel like this was a unique year in the high country all across the West. Just everybody was packing stuff out in knee deep snow and below 0 temperatures, and so we all have some awesome stories to share. I'm curious, because of what we're talking about today, did you get that mule deer and that elk on public land?
Yeah, they were. Well, actually, the mule deer was on a block management area adjacent to public land, and it's sort of an area where there's a bunch of mixed ownership. But yeah, I killed the elk on national forest.
Nice. I think that's and I did too. My elk, both my elk and deer were national forest. My antelope was on BLM. So it was a good year, and a good time to talk about public land access in the West. And that's why Joel has agreed to join us, and we really appreciate you being here. Can you first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, what it is you do for TRCP, and also what is TRCP? Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in rural Oregon, and I've been hunting and fishing since I was a kid. Got my undergrad at the University of Idaho. I had family out there, and
Go Vandals.
Go Vandals. Came out to Missoula. Got my master's at the University of Montana. Environmental studies, and I came out here, really a big part of it, to come out here and hunt and fish, because I grew up doing a lot of it, and wanted to come to a place where I could have longer seasons and more opportunity. And I've been in Montana for, I think, 16 years now. And I started working for TRCP, actually. I'm just wrapping up my 12th year with the organization, so I've been here a long time. I I started working, in the field, working with like local sportsmen's groups and county commissioners and business owners and things like that on sportsmen's issues. And over the years, my positions evolved, and I currently oversee our Western Public Lands program. I'm the director of our Western Lands program. We've got staff in 8 Western states, and we focus on fish and wildlife habitat conservation, but also public access on public land issues. And in the West, and to give you a little background on TRCP, we were founded back in 2002 because there was a realization that while there were a lot of different hunting and fishing focused groups, they weren't oftentimes talking and coordinating on some of the larger conservation issues that affect sportsmen. And so we were formed as a partnership to help create more dialogue in our community and hopefully get folks on the same page. So when we're going to meet with decision makers, we're asking for the same things, because we feel like if you're in there asking for the same stuff, you're way more likely to get it than if everybody's asking for something else. And right now we have 60 organizational partners, and they kind of run the gamut, hunting and fishing space. So like from Trout Unlimited to the Mule Deer Foundation, also like the wildlife-based groups like the Wildlife Management Institute, Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, as well as like the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable in the outdoor rec space. And we work together on TRCP has 5 primary areas of focus: public lands, which is what I oversee, also private lands, and that's primarily like farm bill, private land conservation programs, working to provide those incentives for private landowners to help conserve habitat on private land, water, marine fisheries, and conservation funding. And with the conservation funding piece, it takes money to do good things for fish and wildlife, and that's the focus of that.
So from a structure standpoint with TRCP, so you talk about all your member partners. Can you have individuals that are members as well, or do you have individuals that are members as well, or is it
we've got
mainly organizational partners?
Over 100,000 individuals who are members / supporters, people who've signed up with TRCP and follow us, and that's through, in addition to social media. So folks who've actually signed up with us that we, reach out to through our email channels and get engaged, and a number of them support us financially.
And to give you a chance to put in a quick plug up front, rather than all the way at the end when people have maybe dropped off, right at the very end, when we get through all the substance, throw in a plug. Where can they find you? Where can they find information about TRCP?
Yeah, sure. So just go to trcp.org. Also, you can find us on, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all that. Also, we're going to be talking about a project that we've been working on regarding access today, and you can go directly to that at unlockingpubliclands.org too. We can talk more about that later, but that's a direct link to the access work that we're going to discuss today.
So let's do that. Let's talk access. And so your role is overseeing the public lands program. Obviously, access to public lands is a big deal in the West, and can you give us an overview of before we get into the work that you've done with TRCP, but just a general overview of why access is so important, and maybe the ownership structure around the West, or even the country, just to lay that foundation for the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, you bet. First off, 36%, according to polling done by the Fish and Wildlife Service, 36% of all hunters in the United States use public lands for some or all of their hunting access. And in the West, that number is even greater. 72% of sportsmen and women depend on public lands for some or all of their hunting access. And so they're super important in just supporting our hunting and fishing traditions in the West. And there's over 640 million acres of public lands across the entire country, that federal public lands, and that includes like forest, national forest lands, Bureau of Land Management lands, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife refuges, Bureau of Reclamation lands, And they're just critical, and they support fish and wildlife habitat, but they're also places that we can all go to. You and I own them, and everybody has, the right to go use those lands. And it's a great equalizer in ensuring that everybody's got an opportunity to go hunt and fish. And just one of the things that really helped serve as a catalyst for a lot of our recent access work is the role of sort of handheld GPSs in public lands access. And if you go back just a decade ago, people were everybody was accessing public lands with paper maps. And when you think about accessing public lands with a paper map, you think about driving down a road to a trailhead where there's probably a pit toilet and an interpretive sign and trails going off. And that's really sort of the traditional way that folks have accessed public lands. But with the advent of first, like handheld GPSs like Garmin's that, companies like Onyx could stick SD cards into that would show within 10 feet where you were in proximity to land ownership. But then also now with smartphone applications, which has taken it to a whole new level, people are able to access lands with a sort of an entirely new level of precision. And what's that done is it's made all these smaller isolated parcels that previously were unmarked, and also previously they were really unavailable because you weren't confident that you could find them without trespassing. It's made those available, millions of acres available to the public for access that previously were accessible but really not available.
I was a soil scientist for the USDA for a bunch of years, and so I thought I had a little secret myself, which is we were using GPS units before everybody else because we were going out and I was like literally mapping soils in these areas, and so I had the opportunity to basically take advantage and get out there and find these locations and these secret spots before everybody else, and now everybody's there. And that's a good thing, as much as I'd like to joke about being like, I had these little secret ways to get in that nobody else could find, because we did have access to a lot of the information that's now more easily is always public information. But now I think the exciting part is it's not just public information that's only accessible to people who have high-end GIS systems and the ability to figure out what your GPS is telling you. Now it's so user friendly. I mean, everybody can do it, and that's hugely important and impactful to hunting. The organization that I work with, my day job is, we know that the number one limiting factor to getting people involved in hunting and or the shooting sports is access. It's access to the opportunity, so the tools and the locations to be able to participate. And those are the big things that are keeping more people from coming out and doing these things. And honestly, if we want a future for hunting and the shooting sports, we have to take care of this. We have to improve it, because as more people, as people drop out of the hunting space, the reason that they are doing it, when you look, almost always it is because it's an access issue. It's because of where they live or access to the ability to do it. That is why people are saying, it's too hard, I'm not going to do it. And it's the same thing for new hunters. When people are trying to get in, it's access to the community. So it's access to information, you or I or Dave, and being able to interact with us to get us out there. But it's also those people, becoming friends with Dave so he shares his secret spot with you. It's access to those locations. It's knowing how to access those public lands. And I think that's part of the exciting part of what you guys are doing, is trying to help people figure out, okay, maybe there's something closer than what you thought. Maybe there's a location that's, not just the real backcountry. You don't have to drive to the wilderness, but maybe there's something that's front country, that's just outside your front door, a place where you can get your foot in the door and start to, participate in this community. And I think it's not just exciting, but critical that you guys are doing this type of work.
I wanted to add, I don't have anything as profound and deep as Nephi, but we're all of the same vintage here. And I just wanted to point out, like last year, I'm out there in the woods with a GPS that, like you described, I can pinpoint within feet of exactly where I am within property boundaries. And I think back to the way I learned as a kid, and we're not that old. I'd like to make that clear to all of our listeners. We're not that old. And I started with a topographic map and a compass, and then a secondary map that would be a BLM ownership map.
And he still doesn't know how to use the compass.
But that's how I navigated the woods to know, to figure out, okay, what clearing am I in? Where's the property boundary? I was using a compass and a topographic map, and that wasn't that long ago. To think that we were, growing up as kids using the technology that our great grandparents were using, right? Like that had been around for hundreds of years. And in the matter of a couple of decades, we pivoted from that to this remarkable technology that's just unlocked the world to so many people.
Now, you guys have done a huge national project, right? I mean, you guys, it's not just, can you describe that project? I mean, I talked about, you talked about how simple it is now for somebody to take their GPS or their smartphone out. You guys went much more in depth than that, though, didn't you? I mean, you guys did the number crunching.
Onyx did the number crunching in partnership with us, but it's really the technology that led to the need and the desire to do the number crunching, in that, in addition to making a bunch of small parcels of accessible land available, those technologies have made the public aware of all these public lands that they can't get to. And when you're driving down that dirt road and you can see across a ranch, and that there's 7,000 acres of BLM land over there, and you're just like, there's no way for me to get to that, right? And so it's really in the last decade that realization even occurred, that people even started to notice those lands existed. And whether it's around a campfire or on an internet hunting forum or in policy circles, like, people started to talk about it, but nobody really knew, like, how many of these lands are there. And so we reached out to Onyx, who has awesome technology, and said, why don't we try and figure this out? Let's see if we can calculate how many of these landlocked lands exist. And by doing that, it'll help sort of, as we look for solutions to this challenge. We need to know the exact number before we'll be able to do that, because people are not going to sort of trying to fix something they're not going to try and fix something they don't understand. And so that was really the idea behind the project.
So how did you define, you said landlocked, and I'm assuming by that you mean public lands that are completely surrounded by private lands.
Yeah.
How did you go about identifying or making a determination of what land was, like, what's your bar for inaccessibility? What
Sure.
equals inaccessible public land?
The definition we use, and there's different ways to go about this, is public land. So basically, either directly or indirectly through an adjoining piece of public land, public lands that have a road touching them in one place, a public road, are considered accessible. If there's no public road touching that individual piece of public land, basically, if you have, like, say, a BLM and Forest Service land they're touching, and you've got a piece of road that goes to the BLM parcel but not the Forest Service parcel, if you could theoretically walk across that, it's considered accessible. So we did not look at the amount of effort required to cross a piece of land, which, those types of considerations I think are important.
So you could have a road touching, and it could be the only access point to a piece of public land that's 9 miles away. And covers, hundreds of thousands of acres. But for purposes of that report, that all of that is accessible. It's just you have to put in the effort to get to some of the far-reaching parts.
That's right. And so it's not a perfect definition.
You want to get that?
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's modern technology. It's not a problem.
My phone's unplugged now.
That'll teach you to call during our podcast.
It's still working though. That's weird.
Well, it's technology.
So, yeah, I mean, we also didn't look. We also wanted to look at permanent legal access, and there's certain places where the public has access, whether it be through the generosity of a landowner whether it be just by allowing their neighbors to use it, whether it be through a state walk-in access program. But also there's some places where there's roads that don't have easements. And it's possible that it's just because nobody knows that there's not an easement. But if there wasn't like permanent legal access, and that access could theoretically be taken away tomorrow, we, for the purposes of this, considered it landlocked. And I know that, and one of the things we did in our work too is we did, focus on some of these things like state walk-in access programs and how they're really important in providing public access to public lands. But when it comes to actually calculating the acreage of landlocked, I mean, those are generally annual, lease agreements with the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. And so properties come in and out of enrollment on a fairly regular basis. And all the western states outside of Nevada have state walk-in access programs. Certain states, like I know Wyoming and Arizona, use those programs to help expand access to public lands. But when it comes to actually trying to define landlocked and what's permanent, we needed a definition that, first off, was feasible in terms of trying to calculate the number. But we also wanted to have a number that was really focused on what we know is secured access versus what is maybe more intermittent access or fragile access, especially as you see, properties that turn over. The current landowner might be great about allowing public access, while the next one, who purchases that land might have a different philosophy about that. And so that just creates a lot of complexity in trying to calculate something like that.
Yeah. And then, to follow up on that, I mean, I think that it creates complexity. And the question is, what's the point? If we're trying to get down to like a decimal number, and that's what we're looking at, we're looking at a rounding error, trying to figure out a rounding error. We're going to argue about, well, here's a rounding error it's more like 96 than 97 or something. And really, when you're talking about those types of additional pieces to adding access, I mean, with what you're doing, you're getting the big picture. Yeah, you can ratchet in tighter and look at some smaller locations, but you are getting the big picture. And I think that gives everybody kind of an overall idea of what we're dealing with. And yes, it will fluctuate slightly. It's not going to fluctuate a whole lot year to year.
Well, I do want to bring up one thing and give you related to that definition and kind of give you an opportunity to address it, because I have heard some concerns from the landowner community, in particular in Wyoming, around this report. And you've kind of addressed the walk-in area programs, and I appreciate that. How there's some like, for example, in Wyoming, the walk-in program has been around since 1998. That's it's more than 20 years, but it's not going back 70, 80 years. And properties do turn over. Some of them have been in there for the entire 20 years and providing access. But you're right, it can go away. But there's one part of Wyoming that I've heard a lot of feedback about this one in particular, and maybe you have too. And I don't know if this is an example that applies in other states. But one thing your report references is the checkerboard region, and the checkerboard meaning, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, but that on either side of the Union Pacific rail line running across southern Wyoming and frankly through large swaths of the west, the federal government gave every other section of property to the railroad and kept the alternating sections to the federal government. So over time, that's private. It's every other section is private, right? And so you have these this looks like a checkerboard of ownership as a result. In Southwest Wyoming, in that checkerboard, there's a grazing association, the Rock Springs Grazing Association, that has for something like 70 years allowed anybody without any kind of written permission of any kind. They've just opened up the entire area, 40 miles wide, 70 miles long, including more than 2 million acres of public and private land, and have just said, we're just treating this as open for recreational use to the public, for all kinds of recreational use, including hunting and fishing. They've received numerous awards for it. And I just know that that's a huge chunk of that Wyoming piece of the report, of the TRCP report. When we talk about minor fluctuations in acres, that's a huge acre amount. And I'm curious if you've heard that feedback and how you'd respond to that criticism that it felt to some of those folks like they were being ignored for the access that they've provided for generations out there.
Well, first of all, that's wonderful that they provide that public access. And, we've been very clear in both our reports, but also in, our public communications that we really appreciate those landowners that go that extra mile to make their lands available. And this report's not intended to take anything away from that, nor is it intended to sort of force any private landowner to do anything. There's a lot of folks in the West that allow public access across their private lands. I know you go to places like rural Nevada, and a lot of areas there just aren't posted, and access isn't really even an issue in some of the checkerboard swath there too, which is the same transcontinental railroad that you referred to along the I-80 corridor. And but when you have to actually create a definition for how to define landlocked, the generosity of one landowner or several landowners is really hard to define, but also it's still up to them. They're still allowing that access. That's still their permission that they're granting to the public. And I think that the purpose of this report is to identify the acres of both of these reports, is to identify the acres of public lands that require permission from a private landowner to access. And then to make that information available to the agencies who are working on providing access for the public, to then look at the local situation. And in places where you have a landowner that is very generous about providing public access, I think the issue's largely been addressed there. I think there's a lot. If you look at a place where there's state walk-in access programs that are opening up certain areas to the public, like you can see that access issue's being addressed there, and that's really for them to determine at the local level. What we wanted to do is highlight how many acres require permission to access, and it has to be definable. I mean, there's people who can poke at this thing, and people love to do that stuff. It's funny too, I know part of it too is the time that we live in. I think we live in a very polarized time, and we've had people poke at us on this report from both sides. We've been very clear about our intentions here are entirely focused on voluntary actions where they're incentive based. So landowners would not be forced. We're not suggesting they'd ever be forced to do anything, that they have to be at the table, they have to want to do this, and that they get the solutions that we point out are financial incentives for them to make lands available. But yet there's been some landowners that are just worried that this, somebody's trying to force them to open access. And that's not the intention of this at all.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And then there's the other side of it, where we've had some individual sportsmen be critical of us for in their minds being milk toast, and how we're, here we are trying to get money for landowners. And what we should be doing is kicking the door down on private lands, and because these are public lands and the public shouldn't be shut out. And so we've gotten it from both sides, which makes me think that we're probably in the right place on this, because we're really trying to thread that needle and be constructive.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say both of those points that you just brought up are ones that I was going to ask you about and wanted to. So first of all, people need to understand that TRCP here, you guys are not advocating some type of regulatory or legislative solution that takes away people's private property rights. That's just not where you guys are going. You guys are making people aware of the challenge that this is, because in order to address this challenge, which I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is, look, it's going to take resources to address this challenge. And we are, you guys are consensus builders, and that's what you do. And there are groups out there, in terms of building consensus, groups like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and others. You work with those folks, because what it's going to take to overcome this, it's going to take collaboration with different groups, with the federal government, with the Nature Conservancy, people that hold easements, and it's going to take an analysis to identify the best way. If we're gonna try and create better access here, how do we do that? And the way that we do that, I think what you guys are saying, is not by going in and trying to, and basically, pissing off all the private landowners by trying to take away private property rights. That's not it. It's working with them to identify a solution that works for everybody. And I think that's what you're saying. I think that's where you guys, that's what you're doing, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And then I also love that you brought up the other point that I was going to bring up was like, there are folks that, want you to be, they're like, we should, go get it. Yeah, we're going to go right. We have a right. We're going to go no matter what. And they're kind of ignoring this aspect of there are people that are out there. There's those private property holders who, I can think of one ranch in particular that, they like literally like surround a chunk of public land, and they have surrounded that for the entirety of their existence for the last 150 plus years. That has been the way that it has been on their ranch. And so then to say, hey, look, we're going to come in and we're going to force you to do things differently. That doesn't really work. You have to have them as partners. So yeah, I applaud you on what you're doing. I had another question for you. So there's a lot of, and I don't think Dave, I don't think we prepped you for this question, so I'm sorry about this, but there's a lot of push right now, or not push, but there's an understanding right now of the impacts that we have through outdoor recreation, especially in areas where we have high population densities, and that some of our public lands are, getting, for lack of a better term, loved to death. So kind of what's your thoughts on that? And then the second piece of that is there are individuals I know who would just as soon have only one spot to access 9 million acres. And these are people who like public lands, but those folks who would say like, yeah, if you're too lazy to put on a backpack and hike for 2 days to get there, you don't deserve to be there. What are your thoughts?
On the first one, that's a legitimate concern. You look at places like Colorado, they have a high population, and there's studies that are showing that just human use all year long, whether it's hiking, mountain biking, skiing, all those activities right on top of elk and deer habitat, that those animals aren't getting any rest. And I think that's clearly something that is a management concern in some places. My immediate reaction in terms of these landlocked lands is they're generally, they're not, big giant mountains for the most part, with big, sort of recreation meccas like Vail, Colorado. It's generally places like eastern Wyoming or eastern Montana, northern Nevada, places that generally don't have a high population base. And really, there might be some folks who go explore those areas and discover them for activities other than hunting and fishing. But I think the predominant use of these lands is going to be hunting. You look at a lot of this country that's generally coulees or sort of river breaks or badlandy kind of stuff. There's some exceptions to this, of course, but a lot of it's you've got these ag fields that were settled, through the Homestead Act, but people didn't settle the broken country because it wasn't that good for farming. And so those are the places that were left unsettled, but they got surrounded by sort of farms and ranches because just because of settlement patterns. It was unintentional, and that's the way it ended up. And so I think there's some exceptions, but they're probably less likely to have the real severe recreation impacts that we're seeing in other places just by their nature. In terms of those places where you have these large landscapes and there might be an access point on one side and not on others, I think that's a good debate. I agree that there does need to be, like, you look at places like the Rocky Mountain Front in Montana, where the access points are really limited. It's a huge landscape. There should be more access. It would be beneficial from a recreation perspective to have more access there. And the landscape is big enough that it can handle it. I think that that's really something that should be left up to sort of local folks to figure out what's best there. But it's a good debate, and I think it probably depends on the place about what's appropriate. Really, for the purposes of this report, we didn't get into that piece of it. We were more about just making sure that people can get there in the first place. Or at least, how do we identify the extent of the problem so we can help create tools that can help people get there in the first place?
Hey, on that report front, so one of the things that I think you were looking at were parcels that, like in the checkerboard, where you might actually have public parcels touching each other, but you can't access them because you have also private parcels touching each other at that four-corner junction, right? And which brings up the concept that people in the West are really familiar with, which is corner crossing, right? And the idea of corner crossing. And so just so we're clear about the report, for purposes of the report, if corner crossing were necessary to access a public parcel, it was viewed as inaccessible. Am I correct about that?
That's right, because corner crossing is generally not considered a legal form of access. I won't say that it's illegal, but it's generally not considered a legal form of access.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that.
Dave hasn't taken it yet. The challenge that I'd given him, I was like, dude, just do it, Dave. Just jump over, and he just won't do it.
But I wanted to address that just briefly. We don't have to go into a deep dive on this by any means. Maybe we will in a future podcast. Actually, maybe do a corner crossing kind of deeper dive. Are you aware of any examples of actual state laws, state statutes passed by legislatures that prohibit corner crossing?
No, I'm not aware of that. I do know that there's been some effort by some groups to try and move bills that would make it legal, but I just feel like this is an issue that is going to continue to remain unsettled. And it's a great way to get membership donations because people are very passionate about it. But I think politically, it's untenable for, I just can't imagine that private landowners would ever agree to that in the legislature. And I just don't see it going anywhere. And so it's really, I think for some people who feel like it's unfair to not be able to cross from one corner to the next, they'd love to be sort of charged up about this issue. But I just don't really see how the current situation really changes.
I'll just to follow up just briefly with it, and then we can move on a little bit, because like I said, I think this is a deeper, longer discussion around corner crossing. But my understanding is that there really, and some listener's going to find something and point me out as being completely wrong here, and that's great. That's fine. I want that to happen if I'm wrong. But I don't think there are any state statutes that prohibit corner crossing. I don't think there's any settled.
There's a statute on trespass, Dave.
There is, but there's a debate about whether crossing a corner is actually a trespass. And states have interpreted it different ways. I know the person that wrote the opinion in the state of Wyoming. I shared a wall with him for a number of years, and so I know that opinion that was written. I know the reasons behind that opinion. I know I was asked to write it that way. In other states, I'm sure are similar. I know that counties enforce that differently. Some might prosecute it, some might not. To your point, Joel, that there's just a lot of unsettledness about it, which is why I found it interesting that in the report you had taken the position of we're just calling it inaccessible, with no asterisk saying we're calling it inaccessible, but it's an area of law that's really unsettled. And I'm just kind of curious that I think I know the rationale that went into making that decision, but I'm curious because that's when you look at the acreage, that's a large chunk of the inaccessible acreage are these acres that if you could corner cross, they would be accessible. If you can't corner cross, they are inaccessible.
I'm going to argue with Dave.
Hang on just a second. Let Joel answer the question first.
Yeah, it's definitely over half the acreage. We don't have the exact acreage because it's more the checkerboard piece is there's some issues with just the way the cadastral systems work and how certain corners overlap. And so to actually do an analysis of it would be intensive. We've talked about it with Onyx. But the reason we chose to consider it inaccessible in the report is that legal opinion, while it's a legal gray area, the sort of general way of thinking is that it's not considered a legal form of access, and that people recommend that you don't do it.
That's correct.
I think if somebody, this is me thinking, not a lawyer, and this is not a recommendation for anyone, but I've read enough about it that I imagine if somebody had a GPS with, and they could find a corner pin and document their crossing really well, there's a high likelihood that they don't get prosecuted if they get caught doing it. But I think that's a personal risk that somebody would need to take. And I think for the purposes of this report, the assumption is that it's not considered a legal form of access.
You, Joel Webster, are a very wise man. And that's,
I agree. I was just providing some context to the question.
No, and
So you said you wanted to argue. There's nothing to argue about.
No, but I mean, when you put out your argument that way, I think what it
I wasn't putting out an argument. I was putting out what the status of the law is across the West.
What it fails to realize is, though the status of the law may be A, the reality is trying to implement it on the ground are B, and B is very hard. And so, as a guy who used to do surveys for a living, the issue is like, our modern GPS units we're like, oh yeah, they're really great within 10 feet. Okay, well, now let's figure out that the reality is when we're out there and we have up to 10 to 30 feet of error, again,
which is why Joel made the point of if you can find that pin,
yes,
that corner pin, right? I think that's exactly what he was getting at.
Exactly. But that's the issue. Like if we got a perfect situation where we had an infinitely accurate GPS and we could find markers, then we might be able to make the case. But again, we're really pushing it to try and make the case. And the issue is that most of these landlocked areas in the West, it's not that good, and the fence lines aren't always where they're supposed to be. And so you're risking a lot, and you're making a lot of landowners who you need to have as partners angry by pushing this issue when you really don't. It's a tricky area, and as a hunter, you better be dang sure that you're not trespassing before you go make somebody angry and trespass. And that's the problem. Right now, you can't do it.
Well, let me complete the legal argument piece, right? Because like I said, I was just providing the contextual background across the West, right? But the legal argument that's been made for why you can't corner cross is even if you can find that pin. So even if you have that
best case scenario,
even if you can find that pin, and you can step across, and that one, your left foot and your right foot never do anything but touch the ground that's public.
I know where you're going, skinny guy.
The argument is you can't make yourself skinny enough to not trespass.
That's right.
Because the argument is that legally the landowner doesn't own just the ground; they own the airspace up to a certain point above that ground too. And so you are trespassing in the airspace, and you can't make yourself infinitely thin.
And you eat a lot of donuts when you're hunting, so you're not getting that.
I do eat a lot of donuts when I hunt. I need that quick carb load, before I go out on a death march. But I'm sure, Joel, you've heard that same argument before. But that has been one of the legal, and that is that's a tough argument to overcome. That as skinny as we like to be going into hunting season, so we can hike all over the mountains, we're not infinitely thin to cross that line without touching airspace of private land.
That's right. I think intent too of the hunter matters in the law, in the eyes of like game wardens, in that if people are trying to cross this corner to hunt public land, they're not intending to hunt private land. And I've just seen some stuff. I've read some stuff that I think in Montana anyway, they're looking at that when they look at these cases.
Yeah, and like I said, every county is treating it differently. There's not a uniform application, and so by listening to this, don't think anybody's advocating for doing one thing or the other. You have to make a choice and be willing to suffer the consequences of that choice. Yep. So just kind of laying out and I think maybe it makes sense in the future to do for us, with this podcast to do a deeper dive.
I feel like we've done one.
We have not. We have not done a deeper dive. And we've had people actually write in asking us, and I think we've been too scared or something to actually take on the corner crossing issue in great depth. But maybe we will. But I think
one last point on this that I think is kind of interesting. You look at like stream access laws in places like Montana, where stream access is provided because people were using those travel corridors, back during the fur bearer days when they were trapping and stuff like that, or moving logs. And there was no similar type transportation across the corner of public land parcels, right? I mean, that's really a modern thing that's been made possible by GPS units. And so to even be able to sort of line up with that corner. And so all those arguments that allow sort of access and things like streams, like, just don't hold up on things like corners. And it's complicated. I think it's fun to talk about and think about, but we've stayed far away from it. And, we're going with the assumption that those lands, are generally considered not accessible.
I think that's fair. Like I said, I just wanted to probe around that issue a little bit because it is such a huge chunk of the land in that report, and I thought it was worth taking on. I do want to.
Should we talk about the acres in the report, just so folks get that?
Do it.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
Just real quick, just a sort of a quick summary of what we found. So we looked at, first in 2018, we worked with Onyx on federal public lands, and we focused on the 11 Western states plus the 2 Dakotas, and found that 9.52 million acres of federal land in that region are landlocked, and that 93% of them are BLM, which is fascinating. 4% Forest Service, and the rest are combined with the other agencies. And Wyoming had by far the most, with over 3 million acres. Nevada second with 2 million, and then Montana with 1.5 million. And then this year, we worked with Onyx on a state landlocked report, which found that 6.35 million acres of state lands this time we just focused on the 11 sort of public land states, are landlocked. And again, the states with the most landlocked are Montana had the most with 1.5 million. And then Arizona and New Mexico each had like about 1.3, and then Wyoming had 1.1. But combined, Wyoming has over 4 million acres of state and federal land that are landlocked, which is pretty impressive and by far has the most.
Hey, so I wrote down these numbers as you were saying them, and by state with the most. And for the state areas of landlocked, what you laid out in order doesn't surprise me in the least, because of the way state lands were allocated to states upon admission to the Union, based on, 2 sections per township, right? It would stand to reason then that Montana being the largest of these state, well, I don't know where California falls in on this, but, having Montana, Arizona, New Mexico, Wyoming, those are 4 of the larger Western states. It would make sense that they would have the most, of these state sections that are inaccessible still.
Sure, and also in state, there's a couple things too to add to that, and I agree with you. Is when the states came to the Union, so the lands that they were granted by the federal government to support state institutions like schools, so state trust lands, the older the state, generally the fewer acres they receive. And so they first just started off receiving 1 section in each township. So in 1785, the federal government created the whole sort of township system with these 36 square mile sections and sections of land. So, the 640 acre square mile sections as part of a way to the public land survey system to sort of help facilitate westward expansion in an orderly fashion, which created the corner crossing situation that we're dealing with today. And what they did is they gave each state a certain number of sections in every township across that entire state, and to help them gain equal footing with existing states. And so that way, if you had like the 13 colonies, for example, they already had their colleges and their other institutions and their school systems. And these new states, they wanted to catch them up as quickly as possible with the established states, and so they'd have some economic parity. And so that's the whole sort of reasoning behind it. And so they started out just so by giving them Section 16. But by the time you got out west, California is the only state that got Section 16. Most of them got 16 and 36, and so they got 2 sections for every township. But then 3 states, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, got 4. So they became more generous over time, and so they got sections 2, 16, 32, and 36 in each township. And so they actually ended up with way more state land overall, which also contributed, I think, to the landlocked numbers. And that New Mexico and Arizona, they've got each 9 million acres of state trust land still, which is a ton.
Yeah, and then a state like Utah not being on that top 4 list that you're talking about, it would make sense. They have, from a percentage standpoint, such a high percentage of that land is already BLM or Forest Service. It's the same reason why you wouldn't see Nevada on that list. Just
easier to get access through different pieces.
Easier to get access through different places. Whereas a state like Wyoming being about 50%, there's a lot more private, and you have a lot more of that intermixed. I would suspect that's kind of why it panned out that way.
I think that's part of it. Also, Utah's done a good job of selling off their state trust lands, while New Mexico and Arizona have not.
Yeah,
that's another topic.
Yeah, I was going to ask, Danish, we'll leave Utah alone today. We're coming for you, though.
They still have quite a bit, actually.
Yeah, they do.
They're not nearly as guilty on that issue as Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. And generally, the older the state, the more that they've sold.
Yeah.
Because the federal government actually imposed more restrictions on how states had to use their state trust lands as time went on, because the earlier states abused basically what they were given there, and they kind of squandered the money. And so it didn't really sort of end up fulfilling its sort of intended use of supporting state institutions as nearly as well as they'd hoped. And so they started imposing restrictions, which I think also helped sort of contribute to why the later states did not sell as many acres.
So you have this, I want to pivot just a little bit.
Yeah.
So you have this, these millions of acres that you've identified as inaccessible. And, I'm still going back to the beginning, going to put that qualifier on it, that it's inaccessible because there's not some permanent way to access them. There might be opportunities to access them through permission or that are out there, but for purposes of this, it's inaccessible because there's not permanent access, right? How do you and you mentioned that you have some ideas for how to start working on this. So you have this report. What are the next steps? What are some ideas that you have for trying to engage with the landowner community, with state and local government, with the federal government, whatever you need to do? What are some of the ideas that you're working on to make some of these places accessible?
Yeah, you bet. And that's a great question. And so first, let me point out that there's both federal and state solutions to this problem, this challenge. And that also, TRCP's role in this is to help create the mechanisms that enable other people to work together to sort of, work out the details about individual pieces of land. Like, so the Elk Foundation, for example, working with the landowner, that's what they do. That's what Western Rivers Conservancy does. What we want to do is help provide information and the tools to make sure that they can be most effective in working with landowners. And so, first off, on the federal side, one of the shocking things to me is that this project has really helped the federal agencies know where they do and do not have access. And the Forest Service, for example, built a lot of roads back in the 70s and 80s and even before then to access their lands for timber production. And oftentimes the public was paying for that. But the Forest Service, back in the day, like, public access was something that people just took for granted. And so sometimes, there'd be a road put in, they'd do a project, and they wouldn't bother securing an easement because they didn't really think it was such a big deal. A lot of times they did, though. And they've actually got 37,000 easements. And that's not all just access easements, it's other kinds of easements as well. But only 5,000 of those are actually in digital mapping systems. And so they still have their easement data in file cabinets at local ranger districts, like down in the basement in a cardboard box. And so when you think about these agencies trying to figure out, where they do and do not have access, like they're sort of woefully underprepared to do that. And so one thing we're trying to do is help those agencies bring their information systems up to the modern era. And OnX's sort of data on the landlocked areas, it's not entirely perfect. There's some easement information that's just missing. We did verify the largest parcels, though, by reaching out to the lands and realty folks at the agencies and having them look it up for us. But I do know that OnX has actually been working with the Forest Service. They've been working with the BLM and the other agencies, as well as some of the state trust agencies and some of the fish and game agencies that work on access programs like state walk-in access programs, to help them basically show them where these landlocked parcels are, to help them focus on their resources to work with landowners to make some of these lands accessible. But also there's some lands that have access right now, but it's not permanent or secured, and people don't realize it. So you might actually have some public lands that everybody thinks there's a public road going to, but they never bother getting an easement to it, and they don't even know that they don't have an easement to it. And maybe that landowner that owns that private land is pro-public access and be willing to sell them an easement tomorrow if they just ask them. But because they don't know that they don't have an easement, nobody's asked them, and then they'll sell it next week to somebody who lives 1,000 miles away and has very little sort of understanding of historical access patterns in that area, which could result in a gate. And so those are the kinds of things that we're working on right now, as information systems with the agencies to try and get them the resources they need, but also to help them prioritize getting this done. So that's one thing that we've been doing. Originally, when this project came out, we were really focused on getting the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the federal program that uses receipts from offshore oil and gas development, and sort of that money up to $900 million annually goes towards outdoor recreation type conservation and wildlife conservation type projects, with 40% of it going to federal use as well. This original report was really focused on that because there's a percentage of the Land and Water Conservation Fund that has to be used for public access. And up to a minimum of $15 million every year in the Land and Water Conservation Fund must be used to expand or establish public access to places. And helping to highlight this issue really helped get that across the finish line. We had several members of Congress actually point to this report as their reason for wanting to see LWCF reauthorized, which it was earlier this year. So that's sort of one piece of it. On the state side, so I feel like the state programs are more nascent than the federal ones in terms of access. And the federal stuff's not that old. Like the LWCF component for funding access wasn't even established until 2012, when they started appropriating dollars specifically for access. And historically, projects that are access related don't score very well under LWCF criteria. And so a lot of this work really hasn't been done. This is kind of a new thing. But on the state side, like the state of Montana has been a real leader on this issue, and the legislature, in a bipartisan way, has in this last sort of half decade moved several bills designed to set up programs that help both the State Department of Natural Resources and Conservation and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks work with landowners to purchase easements, as well as provide tax incentives if they provide access across their land to public lands. And so Montana's been doing some really cool stuff, but if you look in other states, there's a lot of opportunity there for other states to be doing this. And hopefully, we showcase what's going on in Montana is hopefully something that those types of ideas can be potentially replicated in other places. And this is not just an access issue from a recreation perspective too. I mean, getting to these lands is really important from a management perspective too. So whether or not it's doing vegetation management like logging, or improving wildlife habitat, but it's also other things like grazing and energy development. All those things depend on this access. And so this work has multiple benefits.
What's your time horizon? Forever?
Well, I think on the sort of federal piece, we're currently working to try and help set some things up to help them. I can't really share any specifics at the moment, but trying to help the federal government get their information systems, up to speed, and so they can actually use GIS technologies to identify access problems or challenges and prioritize solutions. On the state side, we're mostly focused on the federal sort of policy end. We're more in a support role, but we really want this to be used as a tool that people can take to their individual state houses. And so really, this is something that everybody's been buzzing about, whether it's in Wyoming or other places. And we want this to be a resource for people in those states. And so they can sit down with lawmakers and be like, hey, look what they're doing in Montana. Look at the extent of this problem in our state. We've got some opportunities here to open these lands to the public, and let's find a way to do it that benefits landowners, it benefits the public, and makes these land accessible.
So one of the things I really like about what you're talking about on the federal side, about getting systems, these systems updated so that, frankly, can better understand and better communicate what they have and places where they might have needs. I'm willing to put money. I'd put a lot of money down that you have this report talking about inaccessible, and part of inaccessible is not knowing that it is accessible. I would suspect that there are quite a few parcels of public land out there that do have permanent easements to them, and we just don't know about it because, like you mentioned, some of these easements are buried in boxes that haven't been seen since they were signed 50 years ago, and they haven't been, or older, and they haven't been updated, and they might be perpetual easements for access for hunting and fishing and other recreation. And because of a system problem within the federal government, the public doesn't know what it actually has access to already, and so I'll be interested. I think I really like hearing that, because I think that should be a really high priority. I always think it's important to, before you start asking for more, to get your house in order first. Yeah, and I understand asking for more in the process, but getting your house in order and knowing what you have is, I think it'd be kind of embarrassing if you go out and get a second easement for something you already have an easement on, right? And so,
agree with that.
So I like hearing that that's one of the things you're working on, because I guarantee you that with all of these millions of acres you've identified, that at least some of those parcels are accessible, but we just don't know it.
But nobody knows it.
But we just don't know it.
I guarantee you're right about that too. Yeah. And this is one of those strange situations where they actually have money now to solve the problem, because LWCF's been reauthorized and there's a dedicated 3% in that program that must be used for this. But the agencies don't yet have their ducks in a row in terms of knowing exactly what the extent of their access challenges are.
Right.
Institutional inertia.
And there's lots of really worthy projects out there. There's groups like RMEF that have done a really good job themselves of identifying accessibility problems. The Onyx information has also been really helpful. And so we've made huge gains just in the last couple of years on this stuff. But it could be a lot better. And it also could be done in a lot more systematic way, where you just populate a screen with a map and it shows you where your gaps are in a road system, like where you just don't have an access right. And that makes it pretty easy to be like, well, we need to go talk to that landowner, versus being like, I don't know.
That exciting project, and I think throwing a bone out to the offices of outdoor recreation that have been created in a lot of states, including these western states. That's the one thing that I know that Wyoming's Office of Outdoor Recreation was in discussions about, where how they could make, basically they were looking at doing a somewhat like OnX has done, like doing a mapping program. They called it their super map or whatever, that people would be able to come into a state and then identify the outdoor recreation that they wanted to participate in, and then have maps that would show them these are the locations where you can go participate in these activities. So trying to kind of bring all this information that's out there into one house to try and solve some of these problems. And I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities like that.
And to build on that, the Office of Outdoor Recreation piece, one thing that Montana has done in addition to that, they've created an access specialist position, where their role is to work with private landowners and land management agencies to identify and create opportunities to increase access to places where it currently doesn't exist. And I see that as a real logical extension of the offices of outdoor recreation, as things that they can be doing in other states to help break through on this issue.
Yep, I think a lot of people, as hunters, we see this access piece every day. We've got a lot of allies waiting. We just haven't figured out how to harness them yet in those other outdoor recreation pursuits that are also outdoor based. And I think it's exciting to think of how we can collaborate on these opportunities to make them more available for everybody.
Yeah, as long as when we open up an area for prime mule deer hunting, I don't have to compete with an e-biker back in there or something.
It's very exclusive, and that's going to be part of the challenge. Is that we again recognizing that these places are for everybody. And the other thing I said, when we bring those other people in, typically hunters. There's a tradition of respect for landowners among hunters because we've done this for long enough that we get it. Some of these other recreation communities, when you bring them in, they may not get it. And that's one of the things that we face. I think when I talk to people about access is letting people know that, hey, when you've been granted access across somebody's pasture so that you can get in here and hunt as a public landowner, I know that that private landowners have closed access because of recreation damage caused by other users, by Dave's electric bicycle. Suddenly, somebody posts, "Hey, this is the greatest thing ever. You just go across this guy's pasture, and then you're in all this, this new area that it's undiscovered, virgin territory. And we're gonna, we get to go do this." Well, that's something that we need to be cognizant of. Us as hunters, we need to be cognizant of sharing with the other members of the recreational community. Hey, don't blow this. And at the same time, we have to teach them. To respect and build these relationships also so that we can maintain these opportunities for access that we all enjoy. There's a certain amount of respect that's necessary to make these things work.
Hey, Joel, I appreciate all the work you're doing on this. And, obviously Nephi and I follow, what TRCP does and the work that you're doing on access is a big deal. And I hope, everybody listening, if you weren't familiar with it, we'll head over to your website and download the report. And you gave the address earlier. I already forgot it. So you can plug it again for unlocking the
public lands. Unlockingpubliclands.org is what it is.
Great. And you can go get the report and check it out for yourself. This is. Access is a big deal when we're talking about recruiting the next generation of hunters, maintaining the hunters we've got. Access, and like Nephi pointed out, access and opportunity is critical. So we really do appreciate the work you've done. We want to ask you one more question before we let you go. We ask every guest this same question, so all our listeners know this is coming. I think I told you this was coming, right? So you're on the Your Mountain podcast, and we're dealing with talking about issues related to lands, water, wildlife, all these things that are so important to us as hunters and anglers. And everybody seems to have that special place to them, and that place that's so important to them that makes them passionate about these issues. It can be a metaphorical place, can be a very specific place, and we're kind of curious. Not kind of, we're absolutely curious. We want to know, what's your mountain?
It's such a hard question, and I feel like it moves for me every few years because I'm always trying to explore new country. But there's a mountain in southwest Montana that is pretty special. It sort of rises up out of the sagebrush and bunch grass, and it's timbered on the top. And Buddy and I have gone in there the last 2 years, and we've killed bulls on opening day, and we climbed for 2 hours in the dark, and we're up above everybody else by about 1,500 feet. They're all hunting down there where the elk aren't, and we're up there in the elk, and it's a pretty special spot. And it's really cool in that, there's not really any weeds in there. Everything still kind of makes sense. And just the bunch grass and everything. And it's cool with all these aspen draws running down off the mountain. And it's a pretty special spot that I look forward to all year long.
I love hearing everybody's mountain. I love how everybody's is just just so different and so unique to themselves. And so we really appreciate you sharing that. You have anything else you want to add before we sign off?
I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to come on your show and talk about this. I always enjoy seeing you guys, and it's good to do it over the radio.
I wish we could do this in person. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up when we're at one of these meetings together somewhere down the line. But we appreciate you taking the time to spend with us. It's it's this kind of stuff that I think helps really educate folks about what's going on with their land, water, and wildlife, and in the West and around the country. And so we thank you for coming on, and thank you for doing the work that you do. And look forward to talking to you again soon. And for everybody else that's out there listening, as you know, keep in mind that life is about experiences. So go have one.